This is a continuation of part 1 of a series where I talk about Fire Emblem Fates and its storytelling and why I think it's kinda booty. A lot of what I'm saying here is a continuation of the first part, so if you feel confused, just go watch that one first. I understand that ragging on the story of Fates is really overdone, and maybe people just find it sort of irritating at this point, and I don't really blame you, but I'm mostly just doing this for my own enjoyment. And also, in part, because I feel a lot of criticism for this game begins and ends at Corrin annoying, Garen bad, conquer country to have Slime Man sit on throne. Sure, those things are definitely still problems, but it goes a lot deeper than just that. Last time I talked about all of the major characters one by one, but what about the world itself, the lore, the history? To start, it's very bare bones. One of the first things you'll notice is that the game uses a geographical map to present locations and countries to you rather than a political map like the rest of the Fire Emblem series. This may seem like it's not a big deal at first other than the fact that it just looks kinda ugly, but when so much of the story is about the political conflict between nations, it's a pretty big issue that you can't actually see the borders of those nations. Actual locations become vague and nebulous. The other thing we can glean from the map is that very few places are actually given proper names. Distant village, northern fortress, these are all vague descriptions more than they are names. The example of this that stands out to me the most, mostly due to just how inconsistent it feels, is the Hoshiden capital on the overworld map being called, wait for it, Hoshiden Capital, despite the fact that the Norian capital of Windmire is actually called that on the map. A petty complaint by itself, I know, but it just kind of goes to show how sloppy the world building is and how little thought seems to have been put into it. The original Japanese names for Nor and Hoshido literally just translate to White Kingdom and Dark Kingdom. The two main countries did not have names. The continent doesn't even have a fucking name, even though every other continent in every other FE game does. Which is not to say that the setting having a name is suddenly the end-all be-all of whether a piece has detailed world building, and in fact isn't particularly important by itself in the grand scheme of things. But I think in some cases it can be kind of symptomatic of bigger issues if the writers can't even be bothered to give names to things. Part of the history that has always stood out to me as being underdeveloped, despite seeming important, is the first dragon, because the game tells you next to nothing about them. Anankos is obviously the most relevant one, being the greater scope villain and also literally your dad, but almost nothing about the others. The only other one with a name is Moro, and only ever in some random throwaway line that I'm pretty sure 99% of players immediately forgot about. Some of them seem to have some kind of elemental alignment, but there's also the more vaguely defined ones like the Dawn and Dusk dragons that are the patrons of Hoshido and Nor respectively. Or Anankos simply being described as a silent dragon, whatever that means, despite the heavy implication that he has some connection to water. There's also the Rainbow Sage, who I guess forged the legendary weapons, and I'm just gonna assume his elemental affinity is Pride Month. But the most confusingly unexplored part of the first dragons is their relationship with humans. The dragons went to war with each other at some point in the distant past. That's something I forgot to mention. They don't even tell you what year the game takes place in, and either had children with humans or made some kind of pact, resulting in descendants who can harness dragon veins. And just as a side note about the dragon veins, I know I'm playing a Fire Emblem game and all, but there's also the weirdly unsavory undertones that come with giving all of your royal characters in particular powers that just make them inherently better. I'm aware that this probably sounds dumb, but just because it's a Fire Emblem game where the main characters are pretty much always royalty, doesn't mean I have to like or not be a little bothered by this game's usage of what are essentially superpowers explicitly tied to its royal family members. And I'd be lying if I said that this trope, as common as it might be in fantasy, didn't rub me the wrong way a lot of the time. I will continue to say this until the end of time. Just because you're making a story about medieval princes and princesses with all the baggage that might include, doesn't mean you have to accept every problematic writing trope in that genre uncritically and include it in your story. It worked in Three Houses, but that was because they actually took the time to look at its Dragon Vein equivalent, that being crests, in a critical lens, and not only that, but utilize it as a way to look at the system of nobility as a whole critically. Here, you're supposed to simply embrace it without question. This kind of ties into how far too much of the game centers around royalty and nobility. And I'm not just talking about the central conflict being about Corrin's family, because I think that part is actually pretty interesting in theory. But the thing is, every royal except for Corrin and Azura has 2 retainers in a game that already had way too many royal characters. What this means is that 95% of the cast is either royalty or their job is to serve said royalty, which sucks and it pisses me off a little. Both Birthright and Conquest have a way too small portion of characters that don't fit this trend, but Birthright is especially bad about it. Something I'll get into more later is how the world building hurts the wider playable cast, but the way in which this is relevant right now is that the Hoshidan retainers are all chosen by noble house, as opposed to the Norian retainers, where you can just kinda pick a guy up off the street. And Birthright already has more retainers to begin with because some of them served Mikoto. This means that the one singular Hoshidan character that isn't nobility is Mozu, who is route neutral anyways. With things like this, it's really important to take into account your audience. The average player is not some high-born rich kid who's had everything handed to them on a silver platter. I already said this in part 1, but if your cast goes too far into being unrelatable, it often leaves the audience feeling alienated and disinterested. The cast of Conquest is generally more relatable because a lot of them are lower class. A lot of them had to painstakingly work their way up to where they are now. And even without all of that, the cast basically just being oops all retainers is still detrimental because they very rarely have any real reason for joining you beyond the fact that their boss told them to, and that applies regardless of route or country. I'm aware that this issue exists for a lot of newer FE games, but something simply being common doesn't suddenly make it acceptable. Within the context, though, this is also just a problem because it means that pretty much the whole Birthright cast has the same backstory, and there's basically no variety, whereas Conquest actually does have characters from different backgrounds. Another way in which Fates shows some serious bias towards its royal characters is in the sheer bloat in legendary weapons, despite many of these not even really being necessary to exist. This kinda leads into how the game doesn't explain anything before the events of the story prior, but where did any of them except Korin even get the legendary weapons? Ryoma is established explicitly to have inherited the Raijinto from Sumeragi, but no word on the others. It's another one of those things where, yeah, I know, I'm playing Fire Emblem where this is a common trope, but it's super lame that the backstory for all of them is probably actually just, yeah, it was chilling in my dad's basement, so it's mine now. That's really boring and tells me that much like with Korin and the Yato, none of them really earned it. I don't get why the Fujin Yumi and Brynhildr are even needed. It makes more sense to me to only have the Raijinto, Siegfried, and Yato. Because the insistence towards the younger princes also getting super special boy weapons just bloats the whole system and feels completely redundant, as well as the obvious sexism involved with the Fujin Yumi and Brynhildr particularly being given to them just because they're male, like I stated in part 1. I think the Siegfried and Raijinto are actually a little more justified in their existence, because they're given to the oldest heirs of each kingdom and provide a parallel to Korin in whichever route you choose. But the other two are entirely superfluous at best and unfortunate at worst. I'm aware that this point about having so many legendary weapons that go specifically to the royals may come across as a dumb little nitpick in isolation, but it's when put side by side with the rest of the game and how it already emphasizes its royal characters far too much that it starts to feel kinda bad. When the entire premise of the game so inherently centers its royal characters due to the emotional core being about Korin's family, it becomes necessary to de-emphasize their role in other ways to balance it, and yet Fates just goes ahead and does the complete opposite. Leaving that aside, since I was talking about the first dragons before this, the fact that some of the first dragons are considered patrons of certain countries and tribes really begs the question, what's the cultural significance of these dragons in the current day? Anonko implicitly calls the Dusk Dragon the Forgotten God, so how could they be considered patrons and their descendants literally considered royalty when they're supposedly forgotten? Somewhat tied to this, Hoshido has a few classes that are explicitly tied to religion, such as the Shrine Maidens, which says to me that Hoshido is somewhat more religious than Nor, and yet, once again, there is no word on what that actually entails. Garen is stated to worship Anonkos, but it feels extremely odd that the game just never actually mentions it outside of that one character who's possessed by said dragon anyway, especially when the real main villain of Fates is among their ranks. They're sadly very underdeveloped, and their history is just never expanded upon. Characters will even say shit like, "by the gods," and then the game never tells you about said gods. There's also no other history given on the rest of the world before the events of the story aside from maybe the destruction of Vala. The countries all just showed up one day with no word as to how they were founded or their relationship with each other, prior to Garen turning Sumeragi into a pincushion and then kidnapping a baby. That part feels especially bad to me, It doesn't even go over the prior relationship between the two main countries, even though this seems like one of the most crucial parts of the story. Have they gone to war with each other before? Were they friendly with each other? There is absolutely nothing to go off of. You obviously don't have to give us fucking Lord of the Rings, but it gives us far too little to feel interesting. It goes beyond being minimal, it's completely contextless, even despite all of this context being absolutely necessary to understand the story. As for the individual countries themselves, things aren't looking too much better. There's very little in the way of what their daily life looks like in either main country. It's only ever presented as Hoshido is peaceful and everyone is nice, and Nor is cartoonishly hostile and everything wants to kill you, which isn't actual world building. Nor may as well be a vacant wasteland that can harbor no human life at all from the way it gets depicted. And for Hoshido, despite intelligence systems branching out a bit and giving us a country based on something that isn't medieval Europe, they did absolutely nothing to make it engaging beyond what is purely aesthetic, which is kind of a shame. Before I talk about Nor or Hoshido individually though, let's talk about Vala first. Vala isn't even on the map itself, despite seeming like it would have fit pretty easily on the northern section of the map. Instead, it's entirely disconnected, stuck in this alternate dimension inside the bottomless canyon. It's such an unnecessary decision that just brings up a lot of questions. Was it on the actual map prior to its destruction? If it was, did that area then get replaced with vacant land, or did they just reform the continent to where that land never existed at all? Both explanations just bring more questions than answers. I think it would have to be the case where it was always inside the canyon, since you see stone bridges connecting different floating islands, but these structures obviously wouldn't exist if it was only like this as a result of its destruction. But if Vala already was in a different dimension before its decline, how did it get there? How did people discover it? Why did they decide to establish a country there? Why is there just a portal to Dreamweavers in the middle of a fucking canyon? The big issue with all of this, of course, is that Vala has no in-universe justification for existing. And not only that, but its existence also just brings about more complications. Not everything in a world needs explaining, but we need enough information to truly contextualize that world and feel invested in it, which it obviously doesn't do. It becomes a trend how Fates will consistently underexplain things important to understanding the story, including but not limited to the world building, and then repeatedly over-explains other things like how evil Nor is to the point of insulting your intelligence. Getting back to Vala, the Valite Curse is one of the dumbest plot points in this entire game. They needed some reason for people to not just go for the obvious bad guy right away, but instead of giving an actual reason, they chose the laziest solution imaginable and just made it so that no one can actually know about it. Not to mention that it's also just poorly defined. There's nothing to say that Azura can't write it down, but if the curse covers that too, then it's extremely important information that is being left out. It's just another way in which Vala feels isolated from everything else because nobody can ever talk about it or the effect its downfall had on the rest of the continent. This is, within the context of the story, supposed to be a justification for the other routes to never just go kill an Onkos, but even that doesn't work when you realize Corrin goes here during Conquest and Azura still doesn't say anything about it. I think one of the biggest reasons Vala sucks is because, like I said, it's completely isolated. Nothing that happens in Vala has any effect elsewhere in the setting. The whole ass kingdom fell to ruin and its leadership was either killed or forced into hiding, and it affected absolutely no one. Vala itself is mostly floating islands, which I think is actually pretty cool. It looks nice aesthetically, which I think is one of the only positive things I have to say about it. Vala has one other really big issue though, and it's that we never see any civilians or settlements in Vala. I guess Anthony shows up that one time, but this is our only clue that there's anyone still living here who isn't an evil brainwashed shadow guy, and even Anthony turns out to have been deceiving us. The plot of Revelation makes a lot less sense if Vala is completely deserted. There's probably no point in re-establishing a ruler if there's no one there, but the fact that we never see any kind of town or settlement is so strange. Like, who are we even fighting for if there's nobody here? And because we never see any settlements or civilians, we get very little hint as to what Valite culture even looks like. I get the impression it's supposed to have a sort of Greek inspiration due to some of the names, but there's nothing to say for sure. It's such a stark contrast when Hoshido has such an obvious Japanese inspiration and Nor has a darker medieval European setting, that Vala in particular is so vague. Before I talk about Nor and Hoshido, I feel the need to specify again, as I did in Part 1 that I am pretty heavily biased towards Noor and Conquest. Not because Noor is right, because they objectively aren't, but for a pretty wide variety of other reasons. In no small part because Conquest was the first route I played, because I think the characters are a little better, and because many parts of the game made it feel like the writers were playing obvious favorites, which made me honestly detest Birthright quite a bit. This is, again, not supposed to be an objective analysis, and please do not take it as such. These are only supposed to be my dumbass opinions. Moving on to the other two countries, Hoshido is, in no uncertain terms, portrayed as a perfect utopia with quite literally no internal issues whatsoever. All of the official artwork of it looks like this. They are established to be absolutely drowning in resources to the point where food insecurity is not a concept, and their queen, who is also portrayed as being perfect and good in every way, has put a magical barrier around the country with her completely unexplained Mary Sue plot powers, which prevents any kind of violence or other bad things from ever happening because it makes people inside of the barrier lose their will to fight. The issue with making Hoshido perfect with essentially no flaws, beyond just being unrealistic and unbalanced narratively, is how much of a fucking snooze fest this makes it. It can never have any actual notable traits because the writing is so insistent on them doing the best, most morally righteous thing at all times. It's shown with some supports with Azura and when she gets kidnapped and taken to Fort Dragonfall that Hoshido is super xenophobic, but it never really gets talked about or addressed ever, and the xenophobia is quite literally always portrayed as being something else's fault, usually Noor. For example, Oboro is ridiculously xenophobic to the point of literally admitting she will never see Norians as normal people, and instead of doing anything with it whatsoever, the game uses this to go, "See guys, we told you Noor was bad," for like the millionth time. Even Hoshido's extremely sparse faults just feel like they exist purely to hammer home that, hey, we're right actually. Or there's also the fact that Shura had his entire country destroyed and Hoshido still did not let him in, and yet Noor did. So what does the game do when confronted with this information? They frame the only singular time it is ever brought up, not in a way that's supposed to actually get you to focus on Shura's issues and feel for him, but solely to try to get you to focus on Ryoma so everyone can praise him, and once again to emphasize that Hoshido is just so much more desirable than everywhere else. This may seem nitpicky in a vacuum, but when you take into account the context of everything else in the story of this particular chapter, it becomes incredibly obvious what the game is actually doing here. It really seems like every time Fates brings up any troubles that the opposing side is dealing with, it is never for its own sake. It's always just to make the protagonists of whatever route you're in look a certain way. It's also probably not a coincidence that this is only brought up once. Its only real trait that the game actually wants you to put any cognitive thought towards is that it's supposedly peaceful. Obviously, this is a major problem because this is a game where the entire premise is siding with a different country depending on route, so invalidating Noor narratively in this manner shits on the entire premise of the game, but even if it wasn't, it would still be bad. Even Awakening, a game that I often see criticized for having a very traditionally black and white worldview, and this criticism is not without good reason, still put more effort into making Plegia sympathetic by establishing that Chrom's father was an asshole to them. Elise is never portrayed as some perfect utopia, and Plegia is not some Fallout-style toxic wasteland. Awakening was a game where the story was supposed to be black and white from the beginning, and it was still a problem even there. Fates is a story that hinges on the choice being difficult, otherwise there is no point. It takes that same issue Awakening had and turns it up to 11. And not only that, but it puts these qualities in a context that makes them so much less acceptable, to the point where it makes Awakening actively look worse in hindsight. Which sucks, because I actually like the story of Awakening, even despite all of its numerous issues. But Fates makes it just that little bit harder to enjoy because I can't help but see all of their similarities. This constant insistence on the moral good of Hoshido means that nothing interesting happens inside of Hoshido as a result. Noor is established to have a lot of inner conflict, and I really feel like Hoshido would have benefited from some of that. Some kind of corruption within the nobility or power struggle between political factions. Something. Because conflict is interesting. And this lack of conflict makes the wider Hoshidan cast feel extremely bland to me, because very few of them really have faced any challenges or adversity, or have any backstory beyond just that they began existing one day. I find it extremely difficult to sympathize with a cast of characters that have spent their whole lives living in a perfect world where nothing bad is ever allowed to happen. Everyone has trauma, dipshit, it came free with your fucking Xbox. Seriously, they have a magical barrier preventing war from ever happening, they have more resources than they know what to do with, nobody ever goes hungry, their leaders are entirely fair 100% of the time, which isn't how the monarchy works, let's be real, their castle is in the goddamn sky, the sun is literally always shining, and stall vendors just give shit to you for free. No real place is like this. It should go without saying that every place on planet Earth has some variety of massive problems. Even if Hoshido was intended to be portrayed as being well off, going so far as to portray it as perfect is completely unreasonable and just not very motivating to boot. And yet Fates goes so ridiculously far with this insistence towards perfection in its world building that this exaggerated characterization of Hoshido does a miserable job at getting me to care about its cast as a result. That sort of shit is not accurate for anything in real life, and it's to the point where it really begins to rub me the wrong way, because this combined with the obvious moral issue of Nohr and Hoshido's conflict screams writer's favoritism to me with a megaphone. It's to the point where the game is trying so hard to make you believe siding with Hoshido is the objectively right answer, and that Nohr is for little pissy losers, that it reverse psychologied me into finding Hoshido irritating as shit and liking Nohr more as a result. Because even if anyone with a brain can see that Nohr is wrong in this conflict, you know what's worse in fiction than being evil? Being unlikable. I, honest to God, feel like a worse person for having played this game because the writing is so fucking bad at accomplishing its intended goal that it made me like the one-dimensional asshole villain side more than the guys who are objectively the victims in this situation. The literal only thing it has going for it is its unique setting within the series, which is of very little comfort when weighed against every other aspect of its writing. And even this isn't particularly unique outside of the context of the series. Japan and Europe are already the two most common bases for settings within the JRPG genre. But that's enough of me going on about the same point about how it lacks nuance and is guilty of purity soup bullshit and it insists upon itself Lewis or something like that. Let's move on to Nohr, which isn't much better. Nohr is characterized pretty much solely as being a complete wasteland where crime runs rampant and all the leaders of the country are cartoonishly evil. It leans so hard into Nohr having an environment inhospitable for life that it's a wonder that anyone can live there at all, much less establish a country with an actual government or a functioning military force. It may as well be a nuclear wasteland in a constant state of anarchy. It's established that nothing grows there, and even goes so far as to say that Nohr is stuck in an eternal night. I really hate this eternal night idea in the context of this story in particular, because it makes it impossible to see any kind of endpoint where Nohr isn't just completely fucked by sheer nature of it. And if Nohr is stuck in an eternal night, is Hoshido stuck in an eternal daytime? This all implies that there just aren't times of the day, which sounds like a logistical disaster. Their circadian rhythms must be fucking whack, but especially in Nohr because people biologically need sunlight to function normally. How do people in either country tell the time? The water in Nohr is quite literally poisonous if you didn't grow up in Nohr, and there is an entire river on fire. Which I guess is just Ohio. There is also a giant purple void of death here in the middle of the map, which is never explained, but I'm just gonna go ahead and say it's a portal to subspace. Most people living there go so far as to live underground due to how dangerous it is, with its capital being a hole in the ground, and no, I don't mean in the sense of this mysterious subterranean city that you'd see in a high fantasy world. I mean that it is quite literally a hole in the fucking ground. And most people just live in the actual sewers. In context, this is all just another thing being used to justify Nohr being awful in every way. The fact that Nohr as a kingdom even exists is baffling. It really perfectly mirrors the issue I had with Hoshido. Nohr is given no redeeming traits and has no identity beyond just being evil and depressing to live in. It would be comical if it wasn't so frustrating. I think it makes sense for this story for Nohr to be in very dire straits. I think it's honestly necessary to emphasize that for the Nohrian characters to truly be sympathetic, and for it all to at least make logical sense. But they both don't talk about it pretty much at all, and also exaggerate the hellish nature of living there to unbelievability somehow at the same time. Arguably, the most important part of Nohr's world building is in its famine and lack of resources, at least in theory. theory it is. And I specify in theory because it is only established in a single throwaway line of dialogue ass deep into the later chapters of Birthright. In a story that centers around the conflict between Nohr and Hoshido, the fact that the game never properly establishes why Nohr is actually invading is a massive issue. It's even worse because this only shows up in Birthright and not in the route where you're actually siding with Nohr. Why couldn't you just have Xander say in chapter 1 or something, oh yeah, our people are starving and these guys wouldn't help, so now we have to steal from them? Would that have been so hard? I'm not saying it would have suddenly made Nohr completely justified, but again, that's kind of the point. It's supposed to be difficult. Again, all of this just screams narrative favoritism to me. It seems like kind of an intentional choice to not explain Nohr at all, specifically if you choose to side with it, to only talk about it a single time in a way that most players will immediately forget about, and the one time where they do mention Nohr's status in the main story is not framed in a way to get you to empathize with the Nohrian people, but rather purely to pat Ryoma on the dick. Even with the one time they mention it in a support, Azura dismisses it as simple jealousy rather than as any kind of actual problem. Even if this was intended from the start to be a cut and dry, good versus bad story, this level of exaggeration between the two countries is ridiculous. But within the greater context of Fates, it becomes so much worse. The centerpiece of the story of Fates, its number one most crucial aspect, is in its choice. A choice that is supposed to be difficult. Between the people that raised you and who you know are understandable in having to fight the opposing side, and your blood family who only want to see you come home and who want to defend their homeland. That's what Fates should have been. But because Nohr is never given proper moral justification, and because Hoshido's characters and their relationship to Corrin are never given any proper development, the big choice, the whole fucking point of the story, becomes completely moot. The choice goes from which one do I like more to which one do I hate less. It gets so much worse when you take into account that the routes were all sold separately. This means that anyone who bought the wrong route would get told by the game, tough shit, give us more money so we'll stop guilt tripping you, effectively giving the player a massive middle finger for no reason other than because of corporate greed. The fact that the routes are all sold separately means that they should all be satisfying stories in their own right. This therefore mandates that the game gives you a good reason for choosing either side. But even all of this wouldn't be quite as bad as it is if the game wasn't so insistent on the characters telling you every 10 seconds that Nohr is evil and Hoshido is good, like you're a stupid little kid who won't understand otherwise. The second you start up Birthright, the first chapter has Nohr attacking a hospital, and then the game says after you complete the map that the Faceless are made from people. The first chapter of Conquest has Garen threaten to execute you for no reason, and then he sends you off alone to die so you can violently suppress a rebellion. Each chapter only has a couple minutes of cutscenes. It's obviously not done because their target audience is actually tiny little kids though, because the game is rated 13+ in most countries, which means it's only done because of writing that doesn't trust the player or respect their intelligence. Although then again, this is the same fanbase that brought us Three Houses Discourse, so maybe they had a point. A common issue I've brought up is exaggeration. In part 1, I kind of talked about how certain characters dealt with this issue. Takumi doesn't just hate you, he hates you so much he rages at you every time you see him. Azura isn't just cold, she's so cold that she comes across as not caring about anything around her. Likewise, Nohr isn't allowed to just be kind of evil, and Hoshido doesn't just lean sort of heroic. This game takes everything to extremes, nothing is ever allowed to be nuanced or complicated. I hear some people say that it had to be like this. That Nohr had to be completely evil so there was something drawing you towards Birthright, since you're siding with the characters Corrin has more of an emotional attachment to, and vice versa, that Hoshido's cast and their relationships to Corrin and to each other had to be underdeveloped to balance out that you're fighting for the heroes. But no, not really. They didn't have to make any of these decisions. They could have just as easily made each side more morally gray and less utopian or dystopian. They could have just as easily made the Hoshidan characters more interesting and adjusted the world building to fit. They could have made it so that Corrin has more of an emotional attachment to the Hoshidan siblings from the get-go, both by making it so that they get kidnapped a little later in life and that they actually remember things from before. This way, it is actually a difficult choice. It doesn't suddenly become a good but hard choice because you're choosing between the better but more morally questionable characters and worse but nice characters, because no story should rely on certain aspects of it being written poorly. That isn't a feature, it's a bug. If there's one major positive thing I have to say about the world building, it's the aesthetics of each kingdom. I already kinda brought this up with Hoshido, but they're very visually distinct from each other, both culturally and in their strong usage of colors. Hoshido being very traditionally Japanese and having a very bright color scheme with a lot of white and primary colors does a great job of contrasting Nor's dark medieval European vibe, making heavy use of black, gold, and purple in its character designs. Even Vala looks really nice with its dreamlike landscapes and reliance on cool colors and slight water theming with its characters. Something that's kind of a negative though is that the other more minor countries such as Izumo, Mokushu, or Circenzia don't have much of an identity of their own and are more so mini versions of Nor and Hoshido. It's not a huge deal since they're not really the main focus of the game, but it does stick out a little when the two main factions make such a big point of being as different as possible to each other that any of the others are just sort of copy-paste and makes the world feel a little more like it only exists to center Nor and Hoshido. Fates tried to emulate a lot of what they thought made Awakening successful. Its story has very similar beats and similar problems in many ways where they just kinda took the same plot point Awakening had and made it worse, but one of the things that Fates decided to emulate was the child units. Essentially, if two of your units get married, they'll have a kid, and that kid will become a playable unit. This worked in Awakening, however, because it's a vital part of the story. In Fates, however, this does not apply, so they decide to introduce something called the Deep Realms, also known as the Instant Baby Microwave. The Deep Realms are pocket dimensions where time flows differently. This means that days in the main universe could be years in the Deep Realms. So for some reason, the party's solution to when someone has kids during war is to abandon them in the Deep Realms for someone else to take care of until they're grown enough to fight, which to them will only take a matter of days. Apparently, the concept of birth control does not exist to these people. This obviously makes all of your units look like horrible people and extremely negligent parents. This is what happens when this game tries to emulate the more successful Fire Emblem games that came before it without fully understanding why people like those games. Not to even mention the confusing implications for the Fates universe as a whole. Do the people in the Deep Realms know that they're living in the Deep Realms? Is the main Fates dimension a deep realm to a different dimension? Is it normal for that universe to raise children in the Deep Realms? If so, then why isn't it ever brought up? Of course, every character with an established backstory that isn't a child unit is pretty much explicitly stated to have not been raised in the Deep Realms, so the real answer as to how it ties into everything else is simply that the writers didn't think about it and it exists merely to justify the existence of child units. But they chose quite possibly the dumbest way to do so. Something that both this and the Valite Curse make very clear is that certain things in the setting only exist to make things move along smoother. Which is fine if they do a good job of hiding that by making it fit in with everything else and expanding upon it and making it feel organic to that world instead of it just being this tacked on thing. But shit like this is so transparently a plot excuse that it's impossible to think of it as anything else. Speaking of pocket dimensions, I also want to talk very briefly about the My Castle mechanic and its justification in the story. The short of it is that there's no reason for it to show up at all. The whole, oh yeah, I can just warp everyone in my army into a pocket dimension at a moment's notice, just introduces a lot of weird shit when you start to actually consider it, and it's a can of worms that doesn't need to exist. It also doesn't really make any sense as to why they can still use it after Lilith dies, since she's the one that lets them access the astral plane. I'm not saying that the mechanic shouldn't exist, as I enjoy what it brings to the table during the actual gameplay. I'm saying that trying to logically justify it makes the situation worse. All games have some form of ludonarrative dissonance, just have this be one of those things that exists for gameplay purposes and doesn't actually exist in universe. I think the world building is by far one of the things that harms this game the most, because so many other things can basically just be traced back to this. There's no detail, there's no context for any of this, it almost has a child's understanding of the world in a game where that is probably not at all what you want to be going for. I wish you all good luck in these extremely upsetting times, and I will see you all in part 3. Or not, I'm not your dad.